Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is, for 2 days, almost exactly 48 hours, intense conflict enveloped Israel and Islamic Jihad. This conflict, emanating out of Gaza, was not cut of the same cloth as many other previous conflicts that erupted in this area of the Middle East. This conflict was unique in many ways. Most significantly, the conflict pit Islamic Jihad directly against Israel. Islamic Jihad, not Hamas. And while they are both documented terrorist organizations, and while both are headquartered out of Gaza, they are not the same. This time Hamas stood on the sidelines while they tried to present the image of supporting Islamic Jihad. Their words were sparse, and there was no action, no call to arms, no military engagement against Israel, their sworn mutual enemy. Actually, Hamas is pleased with the existing ceasefire that brokered with Israel and that has been in place since May. They did not sanction Islamic Jihad's attacks against Israel, and Israel recognized that. As a result, Israel did not hold Hamas responsible for the Islamic Jihad actions and attacks, even though, in an effort to display unity, Hamas and Islamic Jihad did release a joint statement. In the statement, they claimed that they are united, but it's not true. Their statement read, and I'm quoting here, "We will not accept efforts by the occupation to resume their cowardly policy of targeted killings," unquote. That was simply window dressing and a rather limp declaration. Neither party, not Israel nor Islamic Jihad, wanted an escalation in hostility. They did what they did because it was required. Israel successfully targeted their senior operative and commander, that is Islamic Jihad's commander, the mastermind behind multiple attacks against Israel and Israelis. The Islamic Jihad responded with a barrage of missiles. Hamas certainly did not want the situation to be prolonged or more involved and intense, evidenced by their decision to steer clear of the fray. Islamic Jihad needed to save face and hit back at Israel, and even they were stunned and awed by the precise surgical targeting of Israel. Not many militaries can hit a target asleep in bed, inside their home, and take out only the intended target and his wife. Israel's subsequent strikes were as surgical as the first strike. The IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, has become adept at taking out above-ground Islamic Jihad rockets. Even their targeting of the chief Islamic Jihad commander, al-Atta, was confirmed with a drone that was literally able to see him and confirm who he was and that he was asleep in his bed with his wife, a drone, before launching their strike. Hamas does not control Islamic Jihad. While Hamas is in charge of Gaza, Islamic Jihad is a private organization of about 8,000 fighters. They are funded and beholden to Iran. They want an Islamic State in all of Palestine. And Hamas smiled to themselves, better yet smirked, as Israel took Islamic Jihad down a few notches. In the course of the 48 hours, Islamic Jihad's missiles and rocket depots were either depleted or destroyed, not all of them, but much of them. Islamic Jihad launched well over 450 rockets into Israel in the 48-hour period. That averages about nearly 10 per hour, one rocket every 360 seconds. That's what happens when you shoot so very many rockets with such quick succession. Of course, Iran will pay to refresh Islamic Jihad's supply caches, but building new rockets takes time. Islamic Jihad is unpredictable. Targeting their leader saved Israeli lives, never doubt that. And the aftermath was predictable. But now, the status quo and quiet will resume, thankfully, despite the vast number of missiles hurtling into Israel. And while there was property damage, no Israelis were killed. 32 Palestinians died. Israel maintains that almost all of them were terrorists. And there's a reason for that. Throughout this conflict, the Islamic Jihad committed to two critical international war crimes. Number one, they hid their weapons amongst civilians. And two, they aimed and shot their weapons at civilians. Two human rights war crimes. As if that wasn't enough, Islamic Jihad also threatened the international diplomats who were delivering the messages from Israel for a ceasefire. The threats were twofold. They said intermediaries could get hurt because they were in the way, and they could be hurt because they were delivering messages from Israel. Egypt, in large part, was responsible for brokering the ceasefire. Both sides badly wanted and needed it. persisted nonetheless. The military exchange started on Tuesday and ended on Thursday. The ceasefire between Islamic Jihad and Israel went into effect early Thursday morning at 5:30 a.m. Not surprisingly, as has become the custom, air raid sirens and rockets attacks persisted even after the cutoff time. It's over technically, but it's never really over between Islamic Jihad and Israel. It has been 15 years since the death of Yasser Arafat. In some instances, 15 years is a long time. In others, the time passes very quickly. And it seems like only yesterday that Arafat, at 75 years of age, died. The world has changed in many ways over the past 15 years, but the world that Arafat occupied, the world that he loomed over, remains almost unchanged. 15 years later, and his succession is still a question mark. Arafat's full name was Muhammad Yasser Abu Mahmoud Rauf Arafat al-Qawad al-Husseini. There was a debate as to what made him most famous, or should we say infamous. Was it his diplomatic role as the first president of the Palestinian Authority, or was it his role as a terrorist, both before and after he assumed the chairmanship and presidency, and before as the creator and leader of the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization? His advocates paint him as a liberator, and that is how he's perceived and perceived himself and wanted to be remembered. His detractors use the same paint strokes, and out emerges a corrupt kleptocrat and terrorist, a sponsor of terror bent on enriching himself, who murdered innocent people in pursuit of leaving his mark and conveying his message. Arafat was a complex figure. In 1969, he became chairman of the PLO. 2004, president of the Palestinian National Authority. But it was the decade he spent in Tunisia, the years between 1983 and 93, that reshaped Arafat's public persona and altered his outer demeanor. Perhaps that was when and where he came to the conclusion that the tactics of terror alone, which he had so far used for so long, not only embraced, but also empowered, were becoming less effective. It was there that Arafat changed his tactics and made the transformation from terrorist to terrorist diplomat. In Tunisia, Arafat adopted a two-front assault. One front was acts of terror and the sponsorship of acts of terror, and the other front was the new Arafat, diplomacy. Maybe he figured that that would be a more effective way of attaining his goals. Not only would he have money and power, but also international credibility and recognition. As he reached maturity, international celebrity and recognition were what Yasser Arafat craved more than anything else except for money. It worked. The Oslo Accord significantly helped Arafat attain international credibility, receiving the Nobel Prize, even though he shared it with Israelis Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres, was undeniable proof of his international status. Arafat was given the imprimatur of world leader by leaders of the Western world. And all the while, his followers knew him that he was a hero, continuing to act as a sponsor of terror and against Israel. Arafat sealed his position. You could say that Arafat laughed, as the expression goes, all the way to the bank. But one of the questions still looming these past 15 years is which bank? His tremendous wealth, to the best of our knowledge, has still not been discovered. Literally and figuratively, Arafat dressed to kill. His wardrobe and his look never varied. His keffiyeh, with his natty peaked shaped, was to resemble the map of Palestine. His scruffy day-old stubble, his army fatigues, his pistol and belt sidearm never varied. Not even when he was playing diplomat. Not even when he visited the United Nations. And he got away with it. Very few people questioned him as to why, if he embraced peace, did he still wear army greens and so openly carry a sidearm, even as a prop. The keffiyeh is understandable. It was a source of pride. The drape down the back in the triangle was the Negev desert. It was the map of Palestine. The day-old growth of his beard symbolized that he had no time to shave. It was all image because, truthfully, it takes longer to keep a beard at that length than it does to shave every day. But the scraggly beard went a long way in perpetuating his image. So did the story of how he never spent 2 nights in the same bed for fear of an Israeli assassination team catching up to him. All these years later, not much that can be considered positive has emerged from the Oslo Accords, other than this: than stopping the money Arafat had been funneling from Israel. The VAT, the value-added tax that Palestinian goods were charged and was collected in Israel, was, until it was stopped, was normally deposited directly into Arafat's personal account in Bank Leumi in Tel Aviv, on Rehov Dizengoff. And that's where it stayed. Even after Oslo, that continued from 1994 to 2000, when Israel finally stopped that. And that was minimal corruption. So enormous was the corruption under Arafat that the Israeli military intelligence estimated his personal wealth at $1.3 billion. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, audited the Palestinian Authority in 2003 and found that Arafat simply took $900,000 and deposited it in his own personal account. And they never reported it because that way, by then, Arafat was an international and diplomatic figure. Instead, they whitewashed it. They reported that most of the funds were used to invest in Palestinian causes internally and abroad. Other audits discovered that he and the PLO had accumulated $10 billion in assets abroad, including accounts in the Cayman Islands, massive shares in the Coca-Cola bottling plant in Ramallah, and the cell phone company in Tunisia was all a part of Arafat's portfolio. The list went on, and Arafat kept maintaining that the PLO and the PA was bankrupt, asking for international aid. Strategically, Arafat was masterful. He manipulated and navigated the international community as he sponsored terror against Israel and became elevated to the status of hero and defender of his nation. He had a brilliant understanding of power and asymmetrical power and war. He knew that the world would deem Israel as oppressors when they retaliated against Palestinian terror. Yasser Arafat was a tremendous threat to the security of Israel, and Israel attempted to assassinate him more than once. The missions have names. Operation Saltfish, Operation Goldfish were just two names of operations. Arafat's tradition of corruption and terror continue today. What is missing in today's Palestinian leadership is his style, mastery of the art of manipulation. Their loss, not ours. Coming up next, Points of View. Here's what some important voices have been talking about. Both pieces today are from the Jerusalem Post. One is a column and the other is an editorial. As you know, I write a weekly column for the Jerusalem Post. I have a bias. The Jerusalem Post is one of the most exciting places we have to read and engage in Jewish ideas today. Ideas about Israel and any idea that connects to the Jewish people can be found within the pages of the Jerusalem Post. That's online and in print. The print edition is good, but the online edition is even better, filled with ideas and teeming with new material all the time. It's an example of how a Jewish site can compete in new media and successfully engage using today's cutting-edge technology. First up is a column. It was published on November 18th, 2019, and it was written by Richard Minter, and is entitled Israel's Brain Drain and How One Plucky Nonprofit is Fighting It. It's subtitled, Mass Emigration of Israel's Most Tech-Savvy Individuals Starve Startups of Talented Hires and Puts a Ceiling on Their Growth. Minter presents a twofold problem. Great Israeli minds are leaving Israel for better positions, and that leaves new startups without potential computer hires. Most everyone who leaves is not only computer competent, they are also fluent in English, which is an essential component of the tech world. This is how Minter begins. The startup nation is suffering from a brain drain that threatens its growth. For every Israeli citizen with a university degree who returned from abroad in 2017, a corresponding 4.5 Israelis with degrees left the country that same year. A newly released report by the Shorish Institution for Socioeconomic Research found. The trend has been underway for years and shows no sign of slowing. As a result, Israel relies on an exceptionally small number of professionals, fewer than 130,000, to drive its high-tech economy and healthcare system, the report found. Mass immigration of Israel's most tech-savvy individuals starves startups of talented hires and puts a ceiling on their growth. To make matters worse, many departing Israelis are English speakers, denying Israeli firms of the language skills needed to talk to global customers. Thus, even as Israeli startups like Waze and Mobileye score multi-billion-dollar exits through the likes of Google and Intel in the global market, the domestic outlook for startups is increasingly clouded. Mintner offers more proof of his brain drain. He cites John Medved, the company he co-founded, which is called Our Crowd, as a simple example. Mintner writes that more techies are needed, and I'm quoting here, "Education and immigration have not made up for the brain drain. Israeli startups, supported by Our Crowd's crowdfunding platform, need the assistance of 10,000 more computer science majors," John Medved, Our Crowd's founder and one of Israel's legendary entrepreneurs, said. Hebrew University graduates fewer than 1,000 per year, he adds. Mintner argues that not only is the solution here, there's a group of actually working in order to solve this problem. The group is bringing tech people to Israel, and they are teaching English too. The group has long-term trips to Israel, where young adults, 18 to 35, receive their internships, learn Judaic studies, and teach English. Mintner continues, now amid the talent shortage facing Israeli startups, Masa, Israel Journey, sees a unique opportunity. Masa, the organization that has brought over 130,000 young adults, ages 18 to 30, from more than 60 countries to Israel for long-term study, internships, and Jewish studies programs, is plugging the brain drain and matching educated North Americans with jobs at Israeli startups. Masa is leveraging North American Jews, the world's largest Jewish population, to combat Israel's brain drain. The young adults gain access to the kinds of high-level opportunities at prestigious startups that would have likely eluded them at home due to fierce competition. Meanwhile, Israeli firms receive a much-needed infusion of English-speaking talent in coding and other key technical skills. Masa Fast Track Pro serves as a pipeline for elite young professionals to be placed in top Israeli companies like Checkpoint, Teva Pharmaceuticals, and Playbuzz. Teaching English is the first step in fighting the brain drain. The Masa Israel Teaching Fellows Program arranges for North Americans and Britons to teach English in Israeli schools. Both sides benefit. Israelis learn English and thereby gain access to the global market, and the Masa Fellows improve their resumes through real-world experience. As a bonus, many find that immersing themselves in Israeli culture and life has strengthened their Jewish identities. Mintner concludes by writing, Masa has come up with a blueprint that works. By bringing more talented North Americans to Israel, the startup nation could reverse the brain drain that threatens its future growth. In general, Mintner is correct, but an explanation is required here. The Masa program will not solve the brain drain, but it is a good tool to help funnel good potential techies into the Israeli high-tech system. Once a person has been to Israel on a long-term program and worked in an internship with Israelis, their life will be changed. And maybe they will choose to live in Israel and work and make their profession and their professional contribution in Israel itself. Second up is the Jerusalem Post editorial. It was published on November 14th, 2019, and it's titled Shame on Europe and subtitled, There is no denying that the European Union is engaging in a double standard towards Israel. This editorial condemns the EU court decision that declared that products made in the West Bank may not be labeled made in Israel, but must clearly be labeled as being made in the West Bank. This is how the editorial begins. The European Union's Court of Justice decided this week that products made in Judea and Samaria cannot be labeled made in Israel, mandating that labels be changed in all 28 EU member states. Before the ruling, the EU had only advised such labeling, but now it will be a requirement, and the Union can launch legal proceedings against any state that does not comply. The editorial goes on to say that the Golan and East Jerusalem are included in the labels, and the editorial explains why the court's decision is so wrong. It continues, this decision is an outrage for a number of reasons. First, it came while half of Israel was shut down due to a threat of rockets launched by terrorists into civilian populations. A modicum of consideration would have been appreciated at this time. This singling out of Israel is exactly what former Jewish Agency Chairman Natan Sharansky meant when he wrote in 2004 of the 3 Ds distinguishing anti-Semitism from legitimate criticism of Israel: delegitimization of Israel, demonization of Israel, and subjecting Israel to double standards. There is no denying that the European Union is engaging in a double standard towards Israel as opposed to other territories. There is no similar labeling mandate for other areas under territorial conflict, like Tibet, Northern Cyprus, Western Sahara. As former Justice Minister Ayelet Shaked pointed out, in fact, rather than singling out their products, the EU even has an agreement with Morocco allowing European boats to fish in territorial waters off the Western Sahara. Beyond the formal definition of anti-Semitism, Europeans have a long history of telling Jews where they can and more often can't live, and with whom they can do business, going back centuries. The last conclusion of the Jewish Post editors is very important. It's a little long, but worth hearing. It speaks to the heart of the double standard and the anti-Semitism within the double standard itself. Listen carefully. After all, Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas has said that for him to reach an accord with Israel, the West Bank will have to be free of settlers, meaning Israeli Jews. The brutal Syrian leader, Bashar Assad, who has murdered more than 500,000 of his people in this long civil war, or would Europe prefer ISIS, Iran, or maybe Russia? Israel's control over the Golan helps keep Israel secure and prevents a larger conflict that could erupt and engulf the Middle East. The failure to recognize this simple fact is not just ignorance, it's a lie. And then there's East Jerusalem. Basically, what the EU is saying is that if a menorah is made in the old city and then exported for sale in Paris, it would need to be labeled the capital of the Jewish people for 3,000 years, and its connection to the Jewish people is put into question. This is ridiculous. What Europe seems to fail to understand is that the days when the continent could tell Jews where they can live or where they can do business are over. Those days ended in 1948. For the European Union's top court to make a decision reeking of prejudice on a day when Israelis were most vulnerable is inexcusable. Europe should be ashamed. Wow, this editorial is 100% correct. It calls out the EU court and all those who think along those lines. Unfortunately, not many of those people will ever read this Jerusalem Post editorial. Coming up, commentary through cartoons, where pictures tell the story. Let's look at 3 cartoons today. Actually, 2 cartoons and a news clipping from 1953. The first cartoon is by Joop Bertrams from the Netherlands. It was published on November 18th, 2019, and it's titled In the Pocket. Israeli PM, Prime Minister Netanyahu, is the feature of this cartoon. And at the bottom of the cartoon are the words West Bank, with Israeli flags flying from each letter. Out of Bibi's pocket is the undeniable wisp of blonde hair of US President Donald Trump. The cartoon is explaining that the United States President is doing whatever the Israeli Prime Minister wants. The notion is absurd. There has actually been a serious distancing from Jerusalem by the White House of late, a discussion for another time. But to think that President Trump does what anyone tells him what to do is to not understand President Trump. Next up is a cartoon published on November 18, 2019. It's entitled Trump-Erdogan Meeting. The cartoon is drawn by Parish Nath and was published in the Khalij Times of the United Arab Emirates. The cartoon is making fun of the meeting, especially of Trump saying that it was a wonderful meeting. Sitting on Erdogan's back are 2 proverbial 10,000-pound gorillas. One gorilla is labeled Turkey's assault on Syrian Kurds, and the other is labeled arms deal with Russia. Suffice it to say that given the recent actions and behavior of Turkey, that meeting between President Trump and Erdogan was tense. Turkey is actively asserting itself in ways that are contrary to U.S. interests in the region. You can be sure that Trump told him just that and much more. This last item is a news clipping and was published on Powerline blog on November 3rd, 2019. Remember when we used to clip news items of interest and file them? When I was younger and living in Israel, My mother would send me important clippings so that I would be up to date with events. This clipping is a perfect commentary on our society. It was originally published on April 11th, 1953. It's a series of comments about telephones by Mark Sullivan, president and director of Pacific Telephone and Telegraph Company. In 1953, over 65 years ago, this was what he had to say, and I'm quoting here. Just what form the future telephone will take is, of course, pure speculation. Here is my prophecy. In its final development, the telephone will be carried about by the individual, perhaps as we carry a watch today. It probably will require no dial or equivalent, and I think the users will be able to see each other if they want to as they talk. Who knows? But it may actually translate from one language to another. Mark Sullivan was a modern-day prophet. This was way before Star Trek and Get Smart with his famous shoe phone. Sullivan is speaking in 1953 when telephones were hardwired with dials and cords, and every phone had a rotary dial. Kids today don't even know what a rotary dial is, and every phone, by the way, was black at that time. In a moment, more of my own perspective and a few predictions. The supreme leader of Iran, the Grand Ayatollah Khamenei, announced that he is not anti-Jewish at all. At an Islamic conference in Tehran, the supreme leader told participants, and I'm quoting here, calling for the elimination of the State of Israel does not mean the elimination of the Jewish people, unquote. The comments were posted to his official website. He continued, it means that the people of Palestine, be they Muslim, Christian, or Jewish, should choose their own government, unquote. Iran is responding to claims that they are planning to destroy Israel. The supreme leader wants it to be clear that his attitude towards Israel is political and theological. It is certain that the supreme leader does not really think that there should be an election to determine the political future and leadership of the area. He's making a gesture to rebut the vehement threats to destroy Israel. When you plan to wipe out a nation of 7 million Jews, that's called anti-Semitism. Most of those 7 million people are not religious. They are simply Jews, and they will be targeted because they are Jews. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquant piece of information. Did you know that we often misunderstand the concept of the biblical prophet? I mentioned prophecy and the future when we spoke about the telephone earlier in the program. We have a classic misunderstanding of the role of the prophet in the Bible. Most everyone would say that the prophet predicts the future, and that is what the word in English actually implies. However, that is not what the biblical prophet did. It was not his role at all. The role of the biblical prophet was to convey God's message. It was to convince the people that their ways were wrong. It was a lonely job. People did not want to hear the message of the prophet. They were often ridiculed. To the prophet, there was no gray. Everything was either good or bad, black or white. The prophet's predictions were based on the idea of if-then. If you do not heed the word and change your ways of God, then this will happen. The prophet did not want his predictions to come true. The prophet was one of the great checks and balances in the power struggles that took place in the Bible. Prophets spoke truth to power without fear. They set out a challenge to do the right thing. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please, indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, P.O. Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. and we thank you for your kind support.